browser game, PBBG, uh, is going to be a feature called offline actions, and it allows the player to accumulate wealth and items and progress their character even if they're not online. Now, not every game supports this, and some support it in different manners. Just wanted to go through some of the ways and the reasons why a developer would set it up a certain way so that players can better understand how it's done, why it may not want to be done. So with a game like Idle Quest, there's a kind of your player, and you need an active connection between your browser and the game itself. And the moment you close your browser, the connection is done. Now, keep in mind here a big reason for what we're about to talk about. The big bottleneck in online gaming is the server right here connecting to this little stack of pancakes, the icon for a database. Okay, this connection right here is the most expensive connection in terms of it is far more limited, this connection between the server and the database than the player and the server, right? There's lots of ways to increase the amount of players that can connect to a server and how much this server can handle. There's also such a thing called load balancing, which splits players between multiple servers, right? And these are typically called application servers, right? Split the whole player base between a couple of different servers, and that's fine. And all the application servers talk to the same database. So again, you see this right here becoming the problem. How many connections and how quickly and for how long do those servers have to stay connected to that database? This is why, for example, things like Idle Quest, things like Queslar, Elithor, the progression of the character, you don't want to instantly go up to level 100, right? We're going to say, hey, you're going to take a step and then another step and another step, and we're going to put 6 to 8 seconds between those steps. Cool. So we've stretched that over time. What we've also now created is I don't need to maintain a constant connection to the database, and I don't even have to ping the database every second or half second, right? Once every 6 seconds, once every 8 seconds, right? So when people talk about, and you've seen it with a lot of games, that when they launch, there's a lot of lag as they scale up, right? This is the first time that a game is having more than it's like alpha players. So maybe this application server had all of like 10 players on it, 20 players, 30 players maybe during the alpha, but on launch it's not unreasonable for those games to shoot up 100, 200, 500, 1,000 users within the first day. And again, it's a lot easier to scale up application servers, but how do you keep everyone synced in the same way, synced together, that we're all on the same leaderboard, we're all in the same marketplace, etc. That's where it comes down to the reason why there is lag, right, is typically because this database can only handle so many connections, right? It's not the It's not the application server. So a lot of online game design is trying to minimize how can we design around our weakest point, right? And so PPPGs, they have increased time between, like, hey, rather than updating once every 3 seconds, let's try once every 5, once every 7, etc. So that's the first point. This is also why, and let me just clear this for a second because I want to talk about, get back to now what it takes. That's all of that. What we just talked about was concerning, like what happens when players are connected. And so now we have to talk about what happens when players are not connected between their browser and the application server, right? There's the database. So if the player over here is sleeping, there's 2 ways typically that you could do offline play. So the first is that there is something like an application server. It's typically called like a cron job, a script that runs every X amount of seconds or minutes or hourly. In many games you'll see leaderboards update, say, once a day. And the reason why that is because when you want to pull all the data out of a database and recalculate who's in the lead and then store that again, that could computationally be quite a lot, right? Rather than just say, hey, what are my stats, and just draw out this little bit of information. This is, give me the information for all the players. Then let's rank it, sort it, whatever, and then write it all back in. So a lot of games do that sort of task just once a day, or twice a day, or every 6 hours, or maybe once an hour, right? And sometimes they announce it and sometimes they don't, right? I don't think, well, I won't say it. There's a few games I've played where no one says when the leaderboards update, but it feels like there's like a 15-minute delay, right, between when you gain that experience and when the leaderboard says you've gained that experience. And all of that comes down to the expense of it. And I'm not necessarily talking about like cents and dollars, but there is like some bandwidth expense, some computational cost. So what we now have done here is a cron. And what you can say is that, like, every so often, I'm trying to think which games like this were done back in the day, but every X amount of minutes or something like that, just like what your computer does, right? What your browser does. Every 6 seconds, I do a turn. Every 6 seconds, I do a turn. You could have the equivalent in an offline mode, which is every 6 seconds or every minute or something like that. It performs the actions. And so that while you were sleeping, as long as your character, right, there'd be a query, who has actions, then you perform those actions, right, come up with a total for your reward and store it, and repeat that cycle throughout the night until you were no longer part of the players that had active actions. All right, so that's one way. Keep this in mind. You're having to that cost for the developer, for the database, right? You still have players that are connected here, and then so in addition to that, that strain you're putting on the database, you're saying, hey, I also want to run these other scripts. Now, this loop right here, if you have a game that only has like 20 players, okay, and then there's games out there with 200, okay, there's games out there with 2,000. So the amount of time it takes to pull out those players, simulate them playing their turn, then storing it back in the database. And each one of those, usually these are referred to as records in a database. If I'm just writing to this player or that player, right? If I have to write to 200, if I have to write to 2,000, it's going to take time. It's going to take whatever, fractions of a second, half a second, 2 seconds, who knows? But especially in a game like these idle games where you have a turn every 6 seconds, if it now takes a second to do the process, and then you're doing the whole thing again, 5 seconds later, and then again 5 seconds later, like, that database is not getting any rest, right? It's just going and going and going. Now, often and this is what I've done with games back in the past. You don't necessarily use a cron like that because there's no, if I'm asleep, there's very I'm trying to think, like, in comparison to like Idle Quest, something like Queslar would make a little bit more sense because your pet, so like in Queslar, your pet finding extra stats for you helps you out immediately, right? Like, so during the time that you're that you are asleep, right? Your pet finding stuff for you here and here and here and here. I mean, really, it's continuously. But then you or your party or your clan may be attacked in PvP here and here, and it may help to have that increase of stats. So that's where a cron would come into place. That even if I'm not actively playing, I want my rewards immediately found and applied to my character, so that I am actually powering up as I sleep. So that's something to keep in mind. And also, you could see the way the kind of the logs are for Queslar, right? There's a specific timestamp about when you find something and things like that. So that makes sense. Most games, I feel like, don't need that, especially if there's no PvP when you're offline. With something like Idle Quest, I don't actually need to know what my total gold is until I log back in, right? So I would say that if I'm awake here and then I'm sleeping and I wake back up here, what trinkets or relics or not a relic, so about like trinkets and loot and drops, it doesn't matter when they happened in here, as long as I get them when I log back in. So what you typically do is you keep track of, and this is not what Idle Quest does. Okay, Idle Quest doesn't have offline actions, but this is what it could do, right? What you usually keep is you keep a timestamp of what time your last action took place, right? Last action timestamp. And then when you log back in, it takes a look at how much time has elapsed, right? And that's something like, let's see, if it's one turn every 6 seconds, and then it's 10 turns, so it's 100 turns, right? You get 10 per minute, and then 600 an hour. And if you were asleep for 10 hours, or let's just cut that at 5, right? 3,000 actions have happened, right? So let's go with that. Over the course of 5 hours, 3,000 actions have happened. And what you would do at this moment, you would execute a loop, sort of like, you can see this with, I think it's Melkor Online or something like that. Many games do this. This sort of like, welcome back. Here's what you've gained. And at this moment, you realize, okay, I now have 3,000 turns to execute. based off my current stats, based off what action I'm doing. I'm just going to essentially roll the dice 3,000 times. I'm going to execute very quickly 3,000 actions. And it's not even like I have to do 3,000 quick writes, read and writes to the database. You load whatever your, excuse me, whatever you need to execute one action, and you do that 3,000 times. And then you come up with all the drops, all the gains, all the whatever, and then write that all back to the database, tell the user, hey, since you've last logged in, here's what it is. So the difference between this and the cron job is that you weren't playing. There was no, in one sense, offline actions. There was no action executed while, there was no action executed while you were offline. But because there's a catch-up mechanic, you also haven't lost out on your progression for not being online, right? You can catch back up. And this is nice because during the time you've slept, you've not asked the database for any other connections, read or writes. You haven't asked the application server for any additional computation. So you're not putting any sort of load on the infrastructure of the game. You're just saying, hey, when I log back in, please look at when my last action was and now, and reward me for that gap, right? And so this is another way people do it. You just calculate that catch up and store that. And, you know, running loops and rolling dice, it is not difficult at all or slow for pretty much any language nowadays to do, 3,000, 5,000 turns, simulate that, just running through a loop, and then storing that back. So that's not that difficult at all. And that's pretty much how I would typically do a game nowadays. If there wasn't a need to if there wasn't a need in one of your game mechanics to have the user power up over time, then this sort of catch-up mechanic would be the preferable one. Any game that had, it's not that you couldn't it's not that you couldn't have PvP. It's that does my character change over time? So yeah. Anyway, that's how offline actions would work in most games. So I just wanted to give a couple examples there and explain why game developers would decide one way or another.